Welcome to another episode of Healthcare Connections podcast, powered by Healthcare Compliance Pros. I am your host, Jeremy Winn. Our purpose for this podcast is to introduce you to key topics and experts in the healthcare industry to ensure you have what you need to successfully manage your practice. Please subscribe and follow us on our social media channels to make sure you don't miss any new episodes. If you have recommendations for guests or topics for this podcast, email me at jwin@hcp.md. With that, enjoy this episode of the Healthcare Connections podcast. Welcome to this edition of the Healthcare Connections podcast. I'm Jeremy Winn, your host, Director of Sales at Healthcare Compliance Pros. And we've got a wonderful guest for you today, somebody I met recently, and we kind of hit it off at a conference and talked about getting on the podcast. We have Adam Middleton. He is a partner in the Viability Group. And welcome to the show, Adam.
Thanks, Jeremy. Appreciate you having me.
Yeah, so I'd love if you could give our listeners some background on yourself, what your company does, what you specialize in a little bit, and I'm sure we're going to dive into some of those topics that you specialize in a little deeper. But yeah, I would love to give you that chance to share more.
Thanks, Jeremy. Sure. Yeah, I've been in healthcare since actually when I was in high school as a candy striper. So been doing this for a long time. Everything from medical sales, and then did about 10 years in hospital administration, and then went into consulting. I've been consulting for almost 15 years now. Joined the Viability company about a year and a half ago. Been working with them as a subject matter expert for almost a decade. So joined in with Viability as a partner. And Viability, I'm in Dayton, Ohio, but we're headquartered actually in Brentwood, Tennessee, kind of the mecca of healthcare. Um, we've been down there for a very long time. Viability's been around for about 25 years. We work with both providers and payers, and we kind of say that we kind of live in the white space between the providers and the payers. So we do a lot of work with managed care negotiations. We also work to help develop networks. So we do a lot in that world. And my other partners have a lot of payer history when it comes to what they did, what they worked, while I worked pretty much all my career on the provider side. So we try to utilize their experience and my experience really to help providers and payers have a good conversation and try to get to the best rates that we possibly can when it comes to managed care negotiations. We also do a lot of other things when it comes to revenue cycle optimization, some other pieces, but I know today we're going to concentrate more on the managed care negotiations.
Awesome. Thank you for that introduction. Brentwood, Tennessee, the mecca of healthcare. I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's jump right into what you just said, the managed care contracts. I'm sure this is something physicians, they probably have a love-hate relationship with these. But could you share with us and talk about, why are these so important, why it's important to stay on top of these for a physician or a practice?
Yeah, Jeremy, I think that the main thing when it comes to payer contracts is that oftentimes physicians, when they're starting out or when they buy a practice, they go into a practice, they might have assumed contracts, or they've also assumed that they didn't have any power to do anything about that contract that they signed.
Right.
So oftentimes when we're getting into a practice, what we're finding is that these contracts have not been touched for an exceptionally long time. I mean, it's
Mhm.
not unusual for us to be going in to help renegotiate contracts that have not been looked at for 15 years.
Oh
Um,
my goodness.
yeah, it's kind of sad, but at the same time, I try not to make the provider feel guilty, because it really is a matter of a lot of times they set these and off they go, and they don't feel as if they've got any power to actually negotiate and have these conversations. So this is your top line. I mean, obviously you've got your governmental payers with Medicare, Medicaid, but your commercial business, depending upon what your specialty is going to be anywhere from 40 to 70% of your business.
Right.
So what we really try to work with and educate the physician is that they need to understand their contracts. They need to understand, what the terms of those agreements are. When are they coming due? When can you have the conversation when you fall into a negotiation window? And the other really big factor is really understand what your fee schedules are. Because oftentimes the provider groups will have the contracts, but they actually won't have the fee schedules attached. The payers sometimes don't put those in the contracts. They say that you've got to go to Availity to go get those. or they
Yeah.
don't have copies of the contracts themselves, which happens quite often. So they don't have the fee schedule, so they can't even do a really good comparison when they're reconciling the allowables that are being paid versus what the fee schedule should be.
Yeah.
And oftentimes we find a lot of discrepancies there. So it's very important for physician practice to understand those contracts and to make sure that they're getting paid what they should be getting paid.
Yeah. Is there a, and I'm sure it's all across the board. So maybe this isn't a kind of bit of an unfair question, but when you come into a practice, is there a typical percentage range that you're like, and we can increase you know, your revenue by 2%, 3%? I don't know. Are there certain ranges you're seeing pretty common,
Um,
or is it all over the board?
it's all over the board. A lot of times it is a matter of when was the last time that those contracts were picked up and looked at. And a very important thing to think about is if you haven't touched these contracts in a decade,
Yeah.
physicians oftentimes, because we go in and I know we're going to chat a little bit about what's called the transparency data, and we use this transparency data to figure out where they are in the market. And physicians will figure out that what I'm getting, I'm less than 25-30% less than what maybe some of my competitors are in the market. I want all of that.
Yeah.
Well, you're not going to get that. Even though we think that payers have all kinds of money, they also all do have budgets.
Yeah.
So there's only so much that even a practice with a lot of leverage is going to be able to get, in a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year time period to get them back to a market stance. So
Yeah.
it's important for physicians to understand, and that's one of the reasons you want to stay on top of this, so you're not going to a payer and asking for 20%. It's got to be a more reasonable type of ask.
Absolutely. So those data transparency laws, maybe just for those that aren't familiar with those, maybe provide a little bit of education on those laws, what they are, and then you alluded to this a little bit, but let's dive maybe a little deeper on how can practices use them, how do you use them to help physicians and practices understand their contracts and their position in the market?
Yeah, so when the No Surprise Act came through a couple years back, and I'm sure you guys have had podcasts about this probably 100 times with healthcare compliance pros being who you are, there was a kind of a little known portion of the No Surprise Act that the payers really didn't win out on, because the No Surprise Act was leaned pretty heavily towards the payers. In this particular instance, though, the No Surprise Act requires that every payer buy CPT code and by NPI or tax ID number, that they actually put what their contracted rate by CPT code is for every one of those providers. So now it's out there on their websites in what they call machine readable format, and it's
Mhm.
public information. Now there's billions of data points here. As you can
Yeah.
imagine, every practice on their fee schedule, they've got a fee for every code that CMS has. So you've got hundreds and hundreds of bits of information that are there. So what we've figured out is we've kind of gone in, we've got an IT team inside Viability Company that has kind of cracked the code. So they go and they pull the information by by payer, by plan, by tax ID to be able to take that information and now compare that from one group to another. So when we utilize this information, we take it first off, we'll pull this down, curate it into a usable format. We take the numbers and we actually compare what the payer is paying compared to Medicare, because that's always kind of the standard. Are you getting
Yeah.
110%? Are you getting 77% of Medicare? We
Yeah.
utilize that. And then we start to look to see inside the practice what a payer, basically comparing payer to payer to payer inside the practice, which oftentimes the practice doesn't really understand. They might know that they might be getting a better rate from a UHC versus a blue or whatever, but now we lay all those across. And then the next important piece of what we're able to do now, because it's public information and we don't have to worry about the old contract law where I might know what you were making, but I knew what your competitor across the hallway was making. I wasn't allowed to use that in a
Yeah.
conversation.
Right.
Now I can. It's public information.
Yep.
So now I can say, hey, you know what, Dr. Jeremy, your mom probably wants you to be a doctor. So congratulations, you're a doctor now. Dr.
She
Jeremy,
always did. I let
yeah,
her down.
yeah, same here. So, Dr. Jeremy, I know that you're making, $85 for a 99213, but I know that your competitor across the hallway is making $95 for that. Now I can utilize that in conversations with the payer. So now I can utilize that to leverage our conversation. It's not the only thing we do, of course, when we're having those conversations with the practice and with the payer, but that gives us literally the ability to line out that practice to see where they stand in the market and how we can utilize that, for the good of the negotiation.
Love that. Thank you. That was a great explanation. Hopefully, for those that aren't as familiar with those laws, I think that was really good. Let's shift just a little bit, Adam. We've got new administration up and going. So as of recording, it's the end of February here. We've got RFK officially, in, and Dr. Oz isn't officially in, but potentially heading that way. Those are kind of going to be two of the players that are going to have some say in what happens. Are there
Mhm.
certain things you're monitoring, from the viability company, your group, with this new administration that would be valuable for our listeners to be aware of?
Yeah, I think the main thing that everybody needs to be aware of is that changes in the wind. Even at the end of 2024, at the end of the Biden administration, CMS came out with quite a few changes when it came to managed Medicare, and that
Mm-hmm.
managed Medicare or the Advantage plans that were out there. They were definitely going to be taking some pressure when it came to what they were looking at from star ratings and potential reimbursements. So the payers, which have a very heavily vested investment, in these MA plans, because so much of traditional Medicare now has switched over to the MA plans. It's over
Mm-hmm.
50% now. It's probably 52, 53%, I think the last I saw. um, they've got a lot of money riding on this. So
Yeah.
if they've got um, pressures that might be coming when it comes to the star ratings, that's going to be very very important for them, because when you think about these companies and the payers, and you're trying to negotiate a commercial contract on behalf of the group, the MA plans, the Medicaid plans that might be involved, those all come into play. Sometimes they're all inside the same contract. They might have different rates, but the overall amount of money that a payer is going to have is going to be dictated on their whole book of business, not just
Yeah.
their commercial plan. So we're really watching. We're really watching that. If the Trump administration, goes after the ACA, like they
Mm-hmm.
did in the first administration, if they go after that and they take away the subsidy that are in the ACA um, plans that are there, that makes a major impact to the payers. Which, if it impacts the payers there, it impacts what the payers will pay to physician practices. So the ACA, the managed plans that are out there, that's very critical. And then last but not least is what could happen when it comes to the uh, the Medicaid state plans, and if the
Mm-hmm.
feds pull back some of the subsidies and some of the things that they've done on the Medicaid plans, again, it could be some pretty serious hits to the payers that are out there that are very invested in that. So a lot of changes out there, a lot of unknowns. So we're kind of watching that. That does affect our negotiations. It's
Right.
if a payer's under stress, it's more difficult, for a
Yep.
provider to get more. And that's why we're being very diligent with the providers to say, you've got to have these conversations. You've got to be in the queue.
Yep.
It definitely is taking a little bit longer now to get through the process than it was just 2 or 3 months ago.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit of a slow drag as the payers are trying to figure out what the new environment is for them.
But man, time seems like timing is critical right now. Is looking at your contracts, looking at those, like you said.
Yeah,
So very cool. Okay.
definitely.
So for those that are listening, they're saying, "Man, I'd love to potentially work with Adam and team." What does your typical client look like, Adam? You got a certain size group, certain type group, certain specialties, or all across the board. Maybe share
Yeah,
that with us.
from a specialty perspective, it's all across the board. And when it comes to the size of the group, obviously a group has to have enough size to have a little bit of leverage when it comes to being able to have those conversations and do something about it.
Yep.
But I don't want the small practice just to say I don't have any power. They
Yeah.
definitely should be able to make sure that they're picking the phone up, having those conversations. We typically help groups that are 4 or 5 and above, just from a revenue perspective. When you start
Right.
to think about what it's going to, to be very, honest and transparent on our side,
Right.
what it takes to hire a consultant versus what is going to be your uptake in your contracts.
Right.
So that's an important thing to be thinking about. And I always have that conversation up front with the practices to make sure that that their return on investment to hire us is going to be worthwhile in the long run for what we're going to be able to bring them on the upside of the contracts.
Absolutely. And what's the best way to get a hold of you, Adam?
Sure. Our website is viabilitycompany.com, just straight up www.viabilitycompany.com. My email is amiddleton@viabilitycompany.com.
Okay. This has been really good. I appreciate your time today, Adam. We've worked hard to get this one scheduled through multiple conflicts on both of our ends, and so I
Yeah.
appreciate your time and your effort to make it on the show, and look forward to potentially having you on again here in the future.
Thanks, Jeremy. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Take care.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Healthcare Connections podcast. For more information on the topic we covered today, you can reach out to me or to our guest. For any additional information on healthcare compliance pros, feel free to email me at jwin@hcp.md. Don't forget to tune in next week. Thank you.